Hi, thanks for the introduction. And hello, everyone. Today I will present some work that I've done during my PhD, which is dedicated to engagement in human-robot interaction. And personally, to me, it feels sometimes nowadays as if when it comes to communication, there's nothing else to say besides, well, LLMs will fix everything, and tomorrow communication with artificial agents will be the smoothest it's ever been. And it might be true, we'll see tomorrow. But with my collaborators, we think that human input is still there, it's still important. And one case of it that I'm going to present today is VR telepresence. So going back a little bit in time, my background is actually in cognitive neuroscience, and a part of my project is to investigate how do our brains perceive social robots, and how do we understand what are social entities in general and how to talk to them. And in the beginning of my PhD in 2022, we wanted to run a brain imaging experiment comparing brain activity in conversations with humans or with social robots, in our case, Furhat. But how to make these two conditions really comparable? And while planning out our experiment, as it usually happens, we found a paper that did exactly what we wanted to do just recently. But we thought, okay, let's not be sad, let's learn from that. So in this paper, here you can see their quite complicated setup with a participant in the fMRI scanner talking to a human or a robot agent that are placed in a separate room via bidirectional audio-video links, so having kind of a phone call, a video call. So in this paper, they found that only conversation with a human elicits theory of mind-brain activity, but not the robot. But looking closely at the design of this study, Furhat in this case was operated with a graphic user interface with a set of around 30 pre-written utterances, and operating this interface, choosing and delivering the right utterance was taking noticeably longer than talking back and forth with a human agent. And that was done also in 2019, before the introduction of cool, naturalistic, artificial voices. So we thought, if we can bring human and robot conditions closer together, would social cognition still work only with a human agent, or can we learn more about the social perception of social robots? Maybe this issue will go away if you just plug in an LLM and make it talk, but conversation is a multimodal experience. And as humans, we are very good at noticing if our interlocutor, for example, got disengaged, not only by their speech, but also by their eyes, their posture, gestures, all the small verbal and non-verbal cues that we rely on for successful communication. And the question is, how can we take all these features that we use in conversation and give them to Furhat? So here we suggest using VR telepresence. This is an interface developed by my PhD supervisor, Ekaterina, that uses a Meta Quest Pro VR headset, which has built-in eye tracking and face tracking, and it essentially captures the facial expressions, head movements, eye movements, lip movements of the operator wearing it, and passes them to the robot's face in real time. And at the same time, the operator can look through the robot's eyes through the stereo camera that's installed in Furhat's head and look around the environment. Now let's look at an example of our human agent and Furhat operated by the same person using VR headset. This example is from our brain imaging experiment, so you will hear some background ticking noise. That's the MRI scanner noise, and you'll hear the participant whose brain activity is being recorded. And there are some subtitles, but you don't need to look at them that much because they're not relevant for this case. And the example is in Swedish, but you don't need to understand the content that much.
Hallå!
Hallå!
Hej! Vill du berätta om det sista dilemmat?
Yes. Så det handlar om en spårningsapp.
En spårningsapp?
Ja, så föräldrar kan ha en app som gör att de liksom kan spåra sina barn. Typ genom en klocka eller en telefon.
Hej!
Hej igen.
Vill du berätta om det sista dilemmat?
Gärna. Dilemmat gällde en spårningsapp för barnfamiljer.
Jaha, okej.
Att det fanns ett företag hade utvecklat någon typ av app som skulle med en GPS-spårare skulle göra det möjligt för föräldrar att se vart deras barn befinner sig, vad de gör.
Jag trodde att det redan fanns en sån app.
Det är mycket möjligt.
All right. So we tested this interface in a mixed design user study against two graphic user interfaces. And the key point of the study was to see two perspectives of the users interacting with the robot and the wizards of us controlling the robot through using different interfaces. And in the study, we recruited a set of inexperienced wizards, and they tested the three interfaces with a set of users on the other side that were interacting with the robot. In the two graphic user interfaces, the wizard's output was limited to a pre-written dynamic dialogue tree, and the input that the wizard received consisted of either ASI history and user's video, or the same plus real-time audio feedback. And in the VR condition, the wizards followed the same dialogue tree scenario, but they could say essentially whatever and whenever they felt necessary to maintain the dialogue by using their natural voice. In our study, the VR condition was by far the most preferred by the users based on the Godspeed and the social presence questionnaire. And it also provided the most connected turn-taking flow with the shortest between speaker gaps and few interruptions. And from the wizard's perspective, their interviews showed that VR provided them the most social connection to the users, but at the same time it felt the most demanding for them, but basically for the same reason, because they reported feeling like they had to build up a rapport and felt more responsibility when using the VR interface. So in this case, when the wizard used a novel scenario that they had to go along with talking to strangers, the social immersion acted as a kind of a double-edged sword, providing deeper social connection but requiring higher responsibility. Later, we used this interface in our brain imaging study. This time it was a single person performing as a human confederate or operating the robot with a VR interface. So she was well familiar with her role as a confederate. And in this experiment, interestingly, only a quarter of participants reported feeling some sort of human intervention in the robot condition when explicitly prompted about it, even though the confederate used her natural voice delivered in real time in both cases. The pauses of the robot in this study were still longer than in the human condition, perhaps because the confederate still felt extra responsibility not to react overly human-like. But the average pause duration was comparable to the human-human condition in the previous data that used the graphic user interface. And the initial brain imaging findings comparing human and robot condition when using the VR interface showed that speaking to a human elicited brain activity in the regions overlapping with the area of mind network that are associated with social pragmatic brain functions. And on the contrary, listening to a robot elicited more activity in the sensory auditory areas, despite the same voice being used in both conditions. And it reflects perhaps some kind of expectation from what participants thought the robot would speak and sound like. And it also elicited more activity in the face recognition visual areas. And in previous studies, the suppression of activity in this region was associated with uncanny valley effect. But those studies used still images or non-interactive paradigms. And we suggest that these differences within the same region demonstrate the nuances of processing natural and artificial faces in an interactive manner. But so if you're interested in more brain imaging findings, especially related to engagement, we are continuing this line of work, so stay tuned for more results. But the takeaway message I would like you to keep in mind today is that human in the loop is still valuable even in the era of LLMs, because human can deliver multimodal, spontaneous, rich, behavior that the robot can learn. And using VR for Wizard of Oz and for Telepresence can provide deeper social immersion to the person behind the robot and foster more engaging communication. And thank you, and I would be happy to answer your questions.
So thank you very much, Ekaterina. So I think this was an incredibly thought-provoking presentation, especially regarding the intersection between the embodiment and the perception and the immersive communication technologies. But before we move to the question to the audience questions, I love the last part. I love the last part in the presentation, the takeaway message that I even wrote it down. So you said, "Don't forget humans, learn from the rich, spontaneous behavior." Would it be possible for you to elaborate on this takeaway message?
Um, we started this whole project using VR for specifically for Wizard of Oz setup. So in a case where the wizard is sort of hidden behind the frame. And in HRI, Wizard of Oz is used very widely, but very often the role of the wizard, and the wizard's data is kind of discarded as sort of like just a technical, like a background side of the things. Although that in the case when the wizard is present, that's kind of what is making the interaction happen. So we cannot discard that person behind there. And besides just thinking of their cognitive load of the interface they're using, the possible errors they could have made that affected the interaction, we can also use the person operating the robot to teach the robot. It doesn't have to be, I mean, there is a sort of a directly learning from example strategy in HRI. But in this case, there is a lot of spontaneous behavior that we can learn directly from humans that display this behavior just in the way they do.
I agree, and you're right regarding the part that on both sides, that maybe even we cannot forget him whether he's contributing positively or contributing negatively. But the human is a main role in all of Wizard of Oz experiments, and for the audience. The Wizard of Oz is basically when, as Ekaterina was saying, when he's hiding or when he's not a part of the actual experiment. For anyone who's new to social robotics, because this is very common approach in social robotics. So now Ekaterina will get to the questions from the audience. So one of the questions, it says, Ekaterina, what do you think about robot having very precise human's face and facial behavior?
In the case of our experiment, because personally, when I was doing some early experiments with Furhat and like testing it with people who have never interacted with it, because I think if you interacted with it frequently, you kind of accept whatever behavior it has because you get too used to it. But people who interacted with it the first time, they were giving me some comments of some kind of unexpected like facial behaviors for had because I mean people who interact with it, they're limited to its facial expression, so they have to put extra attention to the way it acts. So when we use this VR interface and we just were showing it around our colleagues at TMH, many people told us that wow, it looks really natural. But that was one of the things we were concerned about, that to our participants, we didn't say anything about the robot's autonomy. So we kind of let them believe whatever they might believe about the robot. But we didn't want them also to feel like there is something shady, something tricky about it, like there's some puppetry. So we didn't want it to look like puppetry. So we were worried, what if it's overly realistic? But in terms of the robot's face, the participants actually did not comment much on it in their interview, so they were more talking about the content of the speech, like the verbal reactions. But in our brain imaging findings, as I mentioned, we saw an increase of activity in the brain areas related to face processing. And as I mentioned, effect in this brain area was associated in previous studies with uncanny valley, but in the opposite direction from what we found. The previous studies were finding, on contrary, a suppression of activity in this area. So sort of the part of cognition directed to face processing was like, okay, that's not a real face, so I don't bother even like processing it. Okay, let's deal with something else. But that was interesting that we found, on contrary, an increase of activation, so sort of more attention directed to the face, even though we thought if it's more natural, it should feel like, shouldn't require extra sort of processing to it. But we thought that maybe it shows some kind of a border between a human-like and obviously artificial, that it's something that the brain cannot quite put a place to. Like, is it should I process it as a normal human, or as
Or is it a
objectively
robot?
like artificial thing? Exactly. Or is it something in between? So there is still this cognitive dissonance, sort of, even with these facial expressions that we try to make more naturalistic. So the fact of it being a plastic thing, it still puts some kind of category in our understanding what it is.
This was a very comprehensive response. Thank you. Thank you for this response. So a part of your answer, a part of your response was actually related to the brain activity, and this brings us to the next question, which is also about this. So the question states, why do you think participants showed more brain activity in sensory auditory areas when listening to the robot, even though it used a natural human voice? So when using a natural human voice, why are we getting more? And this makes sense. The question doesn't make sense. So
Mhm. Indeed, we used, there was the same person in the human and the robot condition, like the voice, the prosody, her turn-taking patterns, they were, well, naturally belonging to this one person in both cases. In previous studies on brain imaging that used also comparison of human and robot, they found also increased activation in those auditory areas in case when the robot had a very robotic voice. So in that case, it would be sort of easy to explain that, well, it sounds less comprehensible, less natural, so you need to put extra processing. But in our case, it was the same voice. So we hypothesized that it reflects some sort of expectation the participants would have from a robot, expecting it to be more robotic. So again, that perhaps reflects this, again, sort of dissonance between something that should I expect it to behave like a human, but it's a robot? Should I expect it to sound like a robot from the 80s? Because all our participants had very low experience interacting with the robots. So for them, it was interesting to see what they expect and what they believe in, because it was also interesting to see that very few of them felt human intervention in it, despite natural voice being played. So a lot of participants, we had to reveal to them in the end, of course, that it was operated by a human. And many of them showed, like, it was sad to see that they're quite disappointed, because they were ready to believe that technology is like, wow, it's super cool. That it's autonomously behaving like that, but we had to reveal to them that they have to wait a little bit more to have it autonomously
to get to
like
that
that.
level.
Exactly. Exactly.
Our last question from the audience, Ekaterina, is what robots were previous studies using?
The studies that I referred to, studying that, starting from the paper that I mentioned in the beginning, they all used Furhat, and there is quite limited brain imaging data with social robots specifically for verbal communication. I think basically that the authors of that paper that I mentioned, they published a data set that resulted in a few publications with different analysis from different groups. And our data set, these are probably to the best of my memory, these are the only two brain imaging data set with human robot like verbal communication
Yes.
in it, and they use Furhat.
Okay. So thank you so much for your presence with us today and for sharing your research, your very interesting research, and for answering our audience questions. So thank you so much and hope to see you again, Ekaterina.
Thank you very much.